In this video, we'll start testing our Photoshop action to make sure it works for our images. All right, so we've got our TIFF files that have been generated here. We could easily filter by them to see all of those, basically just from the raws. And what I'm going to do is I have this portrait action that we've created in other tutorials where I just want to test it and see if it'll work for these, make sure that everything runs accordingly. And if it works on this one, then we'll be able to take all of the others and just run it through that action. Basically, it's a droplet with a series of actions they've created in Photoshop to run through different plugins. So Topaz Labs plugins. I believe this one actually, when we set it up in the studio shoots in another tutorial, I think we set it up with Luminar as well. So here we go. And it loaded up on a different monitor. Pull this over so we can see. So it's doing this automatically. It's just adding a small little bit. So this is something, again, that I do for all of them is after I do the color grading to kind of get it back to the base level, I'll add just I love Topaz Labs plugins. They do a great job of just adding in this case, the sharpening, and then I'll run it through a denoise, just a slight little bit. The key there is subtlety. So you can see this one here is, it's only 5. So it's super, super subtle that I'm doing that. And then if you do too much, then of course it can be too much and you can go way too far on that. But I like adding just a little bit. So there we go. Yep. Okay. So it's pulling into Luminar. So in Luminar, the settings that we have in there when we made this action, again, we're super, super subtle, but it's going to do just a slight little cleanup on the skin. Luminar has great AI technology to detect where the skin is, where the face is, all that. And Photoshop has some great tools inside of it natively as well. But I like using Luminar for that, for some quick touch up that I can do automatically using this action. And then, of course, we can come in and do some custom touch ups on top of it as needed. But this is just another base layer of editing that we can do. So Luminar should have launched by now. Maybe there's something going on. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, let this sit and think for a little bit and see if maybe Luminar is freezing, but we'll give it a minute and see if this comes back to work. And I'll come back either once it works or once we decide what we're going to do next. Okay, so yeah, I've given it about 10 minutes now and it hasn't changed from this. So it seems to be freezing. Let me come in. And normally this would be something I would take out, but we're going to go through this troubleshooting process. So I'm just going to kill Luminar. Stop this action. We'll revert back to the original image. And then let's try running the action inside of Photoshop. So it's this one here. Let's try running it inside of Photoshop to see if maybe it's an issue with just that droplet that we had created. And if so, we can just recreate that. But with this process, so it has to run through, of course, the Topaz Labs images processes again. So sharpening on that layer, denoise we saw before. Process. There we go. Now it should open up Luminar and we'll see if it works in the action. And okay, it doesn't look like it's opening it up. I mean, it should have opened up by now. It's not, it doesn't take that long. So that means it's not an issue with the droplet. It's something with the action itself, and really probably how it's pulling in Luminar. So let's do this. We have this one here where we've removed Luminar. Let's come back in. Let's kill this. We'll go back. And then we will revert. And this here, we'll try the one where we've removed Luminar. And then if we want to pull Luminar in, realistically, for some of these shots, for some of these further away shots, we may not need, since it's going to be more full body anyway, then, you know, you're not going to see Luminar doing the skin touch-ups. This goes in, yeah, so it just skips Luminar. So let's try it with Luminar removed. And again, we're just going to run through this process, what we've seen before, but we're just testing to make sure that this is working. Run through the sharpen, and then it will go through the denoise, and then it should just finish the action, which is building in our frequency separation, that action, that sort of thing, just building out the layers for us. Should pick up once this is done processing. And give it another second here to go through and think. All right. Okay. So it's automatically saving it too, saving it on top of everything, which is something that we had built into that action because that's what we want in the droplet. So at the end, once it's done, it builds out that, it saves the TIFF file, and then closes it basically so that we're ready to go. So that looks like that should work. And then if we want to add in Luminar, we will later on. But once this TIFF file is done saving, there's one last thing we're going to want to do, and that is to rebuild that droplet so that we can work with that droplet and basically crank through all of these images. So I'm going to pause the video while this finishes saving, and then we'll come back when we want to rebuild that droplet. Okay, so that's done saving. So what we want to do is we want to basically take this action and resave that. So let's come in. Let's see if it'll let us, create a droplet with removed. We're going to save it in the project files. And then, okay. Hit OK. And now this droplet here should work for the rest of our images. So let's come into our TIFF files here. We'll filter by those. And let's just take one of these and just drag it in. And what it should do now is open up the file, run through those actions, the plugins, and then it's also building out the layers that we're going to use for editing the individual images later. And then it should save the file, close the file, and then if we had multiples, then of course it's going to run through all of them, but we're basically just testing that. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video while it runs through this, and then we'll come back. Actually, we'll just stay here. We'll just wait through this process. So it goes through the sharpen. You see it's building the layers for us on each one. The denoise. If you want a video on how the different actions, basically just creating layers for each one as they're being created, and then organizing all of that nice. So it's nice and consistent across all of the images. That's something that I prefer, is consistency across the images that I'm editing. So that way, if I open up this file years later, years from now, it'll have these same folders if there's things I want to go in and tweak, or these same layers, I should say. Okay, so it's going to go through the process of writing this, and then it should be done. So now that we know that's going to work, basically the next step is to take all of these. Let's go to our modified date. So this is 4452. That's the one it's working on right now. And then the rest of these, we should be able to run through that process once this one is done. So I'm going to pause this while this finishes saving, and then we'll start the rest of those as soon as this one's done. Okay, so that one is done, which means that these should be ready to go. That one already went. So we should just be able to take all these and it'll just run through the process for all of those. And we can walk away from the computer and let it do its thing. I'm going to hang on for one image just to make sure once that one is done, once this one is done, then it'll move on to the next one. So that's the only thing I want to do before wrapping up this video. Because once we know that the sequence works, and it should, I've done this many, many times before. There's no reason at this point that it shouldn't work, but I'm just going to always make sure before walking away from the computer for a few hours and then coming back to see if it's actually going to work. So this is a little bit harsh on that sharpening, but we may not notice that when, from further out, so it might be okay. Okay, so it should be moving on to the next part after the denoise. There we go. All right. Yep. It took a second, but wrote those, and now it's saving this file. And then once that's done saving, yep, it's opening up the next one. All right, so we should be ready to just walk away, let the computer go through the process of building out our layers for us, adding a little bit of sharpen, a little bit of denoise, not too much because this was a daytime shoot. So I didn't have my ISO cranked too high. It was actually really low. So we should be good to just let the computer crank through these, and we'll wrap this video up. In the next video, we'll come back after these are edited and continue on with our editing. I guess I should say, once the computer's done doing its automatic editing, we'll come back and do some individual edits. All right, I'll see you in the next video.